Hi, everybody. All right, thanks for being here. I guess I just want I guess we'll let him start out by talking a little bit about how he first got into pro wrestling and maybe how you got what working with the WWF in the early days were like, and then we'll go into some Q&A later.
Well, I got into wrestling around the time I was just coming out of the diapers. I thought I had the right look then. Then not long after that, I was. Actually, going back to being honest, my career basically. I think I was kind of in the wrestling business all my life. I used to sell programs for my father at the wrestling shows in Calgary, and every Friday. And usually got done about the time the first match was over. And I would sit right at the timekeeper's table when I was real small, and I would watch some of the greatest wrestlers of that time wrestle. And I, without really realizing, I kind of studied wrestling from the time I was about 5 or 6 years old. I studied and watched really close. I never liked phony wrestlers. I never liked wrestlers that didn't do good work out there. Somebody who was not very good, I didn't like him. And I kind of took that sort of philosophy with me all through my life. I got into wrestling, I wrestled in college and I wrestled in high school. I was city and provincial champion in Canada. But there was no money in any of that. I wanted to get out of it. It was just the perfect, pro wrestling came along just at the right time. It was like I had to get out of the amateur wrestling because it was kind of a dead end road for me. And, the wrestling, working for my father, I remember when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I remember my friends would ask me about get into wrestling. You know, I can remember saying I would never ever be a wrestler, that I didn't like the traveling life. But you did construction and hard labor for 3 or 4 years, and the wrestling life doesn't sound so bad. And so I kind of got into wrestling. I had some good trainers. You know, if you're lucky enough, you train with the Japanese pro wrestlers. They're probably the best trainers and best skilled wrestlers in the world. Hardest working, probably the stiffest wrestlers too. But I learned from 2 Japanese wrestlers that taught me, like, the most important thing you can learn in wrestling is how to fall. It's actually the hardest part, is how to protect yourself and not to get hurt. And I can remember I learned so much falling. I fell in fact, when I did my whole workout, the end of my workout consisted of being body slammed 50 times in a row, straight away, one after another. You just stand up and get slammed again. And but I remember when I was doing all that training, I can remember my older brothers would come in and they didn't do any of that kind of training. They used to kind of, remember the Japanese guys would ask them to come in and do the same stuff, and they would go do their laundry or something else. They didn't want to take 50 slams. But you know, I started out in that kind of, I really, I knew when I got into wrestling that I didn't want to be a wrestler. I wanted to be the best wrestler in the world. I know Punk says all that now, but I was way before him. But I really, you know, tried my very best to always fool my wrestling fan. The fans that were fans of my wrestling, I always wanted to throw a left turn when they thought I was going to make a right turn, and always, you know, I think if you watched a lot of my great matches, there was always a lot of twists and turns that were always just at the right time to kind of take the story out. And you know, as a fan watching wrestling, growing up, I always, you know, I hated when I could figure out what was going to happen before it happened. Always going to move in the corner and watch this and that moves. And, you know, when I wrestle, I don't want people to know what I'm going to do when I'm being thrown into the corner. I don't know what could happen. I could hit it, or I could go flying over top of it, or I could jump out of it and do something to my opponent, or so I always kept a lot of suspense and sort of guesswork into my wrestling matches, which I think is what made me the wrestler that I was. But going back to the wrestling, I think the most important thing I can tell anyone that's ever going to be a wrestler or takes pride in what it takes to be a wrestler is the most important thing about being a professional wrestler is your safety net. I wrestled for 23 years, just about 300 days a year, every year, and I never injured one wrestler, ever. Not one guy ever got hurt. Spanish television announcers, I took out a couple of those. One in particular, if you remember when I wrestled with Kevin Nash at Survivor Series when I won the title, I wiped that table off, and I wiped out that little Spanish-Mexican or Spanish-Puerto Rican ring announcer. They carried him out in a stretcher. And whenever I tell that story about I never hurt one guy in wrestling, I forget that I seriously injured one of the Mexican announcers. But that being about it, I remember Vader one time. He was like a big giant cement truck filled with sauerkraut. Maybe the most foul-smelling wrestler that ever existed. After one match, you never washed his gear, and it smelled like throw up from 100 feet away. But I remember I was with Vader one time, and I said we were in some kind of match. I think it was on a Monday Night Raw, and I said if he's lying down on his back, I said I'm going to get the chair. And I said I'm going to pick up the chair, bash it down on your neck. I said just leave your neck open for this part. I'll never touch it. I'll just come right real close. It'll look like I chopped right on the Adam tap. It'll look great. And he goes, yeah, do that, do it. It's okay, but make sure you move. Make sure you don't move. That's the rule of wrestling. Once the guy jumps off the corner, he can't move because he's already positioned himself. You have to stay there. If you ever watch one of my wrestlers just lie there, it's because you have to. If you move, that's how you get hurt. That's the theory anyway. Anyway, with Vader, I just remember I had a chance to bring that chair down on his throat, and I've done it lots of times with lots of other guys, and you can do it safely. But as soon as I did, I remember Vader, he got scared as I was coming down with the chair, and he tucked his chin, and I broke all his teeth off. I remember I came back after, and I said, you moved. And I remember Vader goes, don't worry, because they're all film caps or something like that. He admitted that it was his fault, so I still stand by my original 23 years ago, not hurting anybody else. It was his own fault. Those are the kind of things that happen in wrestling, so does that answer the question?
That's great. Got another question. I'm from, my hometown's it's a small town called Running, Virginia. We were 18-time state AA wrestling champions in a row. And I wonder how much of that success of the entire town that is behind amateur wrestling is due to the popularity of professional wrestling. How do you see that working out? Like, how did professional wrestling impact amateur wrestling and vice versa?
Well, I think that you have to sort of encompass the whole wrestling sort of history. And, the early pro wrestlers were all really good amateur wrestlers, probably right up to the 50s, even the late 50s. You couldn't get a good wrestling teacher to teach you unless you had a good wrestling background. You came from a college or you did amateur wrestling. Or MMA kind of stuff that I don't think there was a lot of guys that did that kind of stuff but didn't know where to go back then. Wrestling's always been sort of a haven for ex-football players and ex-powerlifters and shot putters and big guys that played other sports and then have nowhere else to go. A lot of really great athletes that like throw javelin. And Jim Neidhart was third in the world shot put guy, and Jim Duggan, and so many wrestlers were all playing pro football and college football. And, you know, wrestling was always a place for people to, if you had a good athletic background, it was a good place to, you know, especially if you got injured and you had to quit your primary sport like football or something, and you blow your knee out, you could get around and perform in pro wrestling and find another life and find another way to be an athlete. You know, there used to be a stronger connection years ago between amateur wrestlers or freestyle type wrestlers and pro wrestlers, and it's become over the last, well, probably the last 30, 40 years, it's become less important whether you can actually wrestle for real. But for me, being a guy that you know, did it and wrestled for a long time, I like my pro wrestlers today to have a bit of wrestling background. When they don't know a headlock from a headlight, it's really hard to believe in them. You know, I just know that I think the best wrestlers always had a bit of a wrestling background, from Kurt Angle or Mr. Perfect, different guys I think of, always do a little bit of amateur wrestling, or, you know, could do enough on the mat, or they were on their high school wrestling team. And all that plays well into your knowledge of grasp of what pro wrestling is supposed to be. Pro wrestling is supposed to be a contest. When they take away the contest part of it, if you don't think it matters, you know, when the match and the outcomes don't matter, it doesn't matter who wins, or it'll never be the deal. You lose interest in it pretty fast. I mean, I think for me, the best wrestling always pretends to be as real as possible, which is why I think I'm the inventor or the creator of the shoot interview. If you go back to wrestling, back, say, in the cartoon days of Hulk Hogan and Iron Sheik on the Saturday morning, no offense. You know, you know, the promos back then were all very cartoony and sort of, everybody had their little, you know, their little phrases and stuff. Anyways, I don't know, I think if you look closely, you'll look back to, say, 1994, 93 maybe. I think that's when the shoot interviews started. I think I did my first real shoot type interviews when, you know, I remember wrestling Yokozuna. I call him a big fat tub of goo, and I remember he was right next to me, and he was like, he didn't like being called big fat tub of goo. But I remember going after him, I said, if I was really mad at you, that's what I would say to you. You know, you just took the title from me, so I'm going to be pretty mad. I remember he scratched his head like, bitch. And so if you look back on those days, you'll see that not long after that, that's when the promos that I started doing became more shoot-oriented, like where I was very serious about my match, serious about the guy I was wrestling with, and serious about the title that I was going to win back, or the title that I was carrying. And all that led to, of course, me, Shawn Michaels, and the screw job. But it also took wrestling in a different direction. I take pride in knowing that I think the wrestlers today, if you look at Daniel Bryan or Bryan Daniels or whatever you call him, CM Punk, some of these guys, you know they weren't watching Hulk Hogan. You know, they just weren't good. They were watching Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Owen Hart, the guys that were really wrestling, I think. And I'm glad for that. I think I helped take wrestling in a better direction where it is right now. I think the young guys that you're watching today are guys that were Bret Hart fans, more than they were Hulk Hogan fans. Not that that's a knock on Hulk or anything. Hulk certainly did his part, you know, opening the door for a lot of us. But I know that for me, I was a serious wrestling fan. And what I tried to deliver as a professional wrestler to the fans was serious wrestling. Make you appreciate the holds, and when I put a hold on a guy, you know, like I never had fans chanting boring in my matches, even though I was putting holds on and stuff. I can remember a lot of wrestling, when you wrestle with a guy in the ring that was generally on the East Coast, they panic as soon as you put them in a side headlock because they're thinking, oh no, they're going to start chanting boring, and you can't have that. I can remember I thought, no, they're not going to shout boring, not yet. You got to give them a couple. You got to get them a lot of headlocks to get boring. But I always, I noticed that I just sort of stuck to my ground game, like the game I always had, the way I always wrestled. And I found right away that, especially in cities where they had real wrestling fans that had watched wrestling for a long time, like Detroit or New York, Madison Square Garden, or even Toronto, Canada, or LA at the Forum. There were certain cities that had wrestling forever, like for 40 or 50 years. And they like wrestling boys. They like the way I wrestled. And I knew right away when I wrestled in those kind of cities that a lot of the wrestlers from that time period were not given that kind of wrestling. They thought that it moved in a different direction now. It was all show business and entertainment. It was all about how you looked and how your jacket looked when you walked out to the ring and stuff. I didn't have a jacket. I didn't have any ring music either. I knew how to wrestle. That's where we are today.
Toxic Pop has a new Facebook page. Like it to see pictures and keep informed about our upcoming events and videos. A link is in the description. Go to www.facebook.com/toxicpop1.